how to make the ultimate professional-looking dungeon terrain for cheap. Today on Dungeon Craft. If you enjoy our content, why not subscribe and hit the bell icon for notifications? Thank you.
Welcome to Dungeon Craft. I'm Professor Dungeonmaster, and this channel is about running the ultimate game of D&D, and to do that, you need the ultimate dungeon terrain. I am a certified Tyrannosaurus Rex. I have collected and built my own terrain for over 20 years now, and I look at terrain as an indispensable part of my game. But before you spend a lot of money on expensive resin pieces or a Proxxon cutter or a 3D printer, you're going to want to watch this. Even if you're a Mind's Eye DM and you're skeptical, this video may change your mind. Now, if you're familiar with the channel, you know I use Dwarven Forge to film cutaway scenes like this one, and viewers have asked, is that what my tabletop game looks like? And the answer is no. This terrain looks great when it's photographed close up on film, but it can be impractical for tabletop use. I have a very large table with a lot of players, and the walls can impede people's line of sight. And just imagine 7 people putting their hands in here, moving the figures around. There's not a whole lot of space. Resin terrain can be expensive, it's difficult to store, and you need a lot of pieces to make your dungeon. Now, you could use a flat mat, but flat mats are, well, they're flat and really boring. You can make your own terrain, but it's time-consuming, and if you're using plaster of Paris or a Proxxon cutter or a 3D printer, it can get messy and expensive. Ultimate dungeon terrain requires only basic tools. You can make all the pieces you'll ever need in just one afternoon. It's light, easy to store, and virtually unbreakable. It's accessible from anywhere you're sitting at the table. Instead of having to reach in and move your miniature, Ultimate Dungeon Terrain is going to bring your miniature to you. Best of all, it's cheap. Cheaper than any professionally produced terrain, and it looks just as good. I know, it almost sounds too good to be true, but you'll be able to judge for yourself in a second. First, I want to thank you for subscribing. We recently crossed the 5,000 subscriber mark, and my video on how to get cheap miniatures crossed the 100,000 subscriber mark. As a thank you, we're going to be giving away a piece of Ultimate Dungeon Terrain absolutely free. Watch till the end of the video and I'll give you the contest details. And now, no more blabbing. Let's get to the table and check out Ultimate Dungeon Terrain.
Here is my table with the dungeon set up. I put you in the position of being at the end of the table. And look over here. You can't see what's going on in this room. The walls are too high. And imagine having to clean up all this at the end of the night only to put it back together next week. It's a nightmare, and it's given rise to the business of high-end gaming tables with that recessed area to put your dungeon terrain in. But that can cost $4,000 or $5,000. Also, you always know where you're going. I mean, you could cover up the map with napkins to have that fog of war, but you still know you're going to be going from one end of the table to the other. But we're about to solve all of these problems. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Ultimate Dungeon Terrain. Ultimate Dungeon Terrain is located in the center of the table, and it allows the Dungeon Master and all the players complete unobstructed views and total access to their miniatures from wherever they're seated. Walls are not included. Instead, they're implied. Here's a chapel of evil, but if I move the pillars outward, it becomes a temple of evil. I use these yellow discs as light source markers. As the characters explore the room with their torches, I place more scenery, and the boundaries of the room and all its features are revealed. I was inspired in part by the board game Kingdom Death. I noticed that although the board is very large, most of the battles take place in the center with the characters surrounding the monster and beating it to death. And it occurred to me that D&D is the same way. You seldom have a battle in a corridor or in a corner. Most of the battles take place in the center of the room with the characters surrounding the monster. Walls are just a distraction, blocking people's line of sight, and laying out the entire dungeon just clutters up the table. Another weird inspiration is the 1960s TV show Batman. If you've ever watched the 3rd season, you're going to notice a distinct lack of walls. Every set is just a black background with some plywood props and furniture in front of it. But as a kid, I didn't even notice this because I was interested in the action, the suspense, and Yvonne Craig in that Batgirl suit. Check out this dungeon. It's just a set of stairs, a door, and 2 stone pillars. You don't even notice there are no walls. Your mind's eye works to fill in the picture. Ultimate Dungeon Terrain works off the same concept. Get a couple of cool terrain pieces in the middle of the room and let the players imagine the rest for themselves. Companies like WizKids and Mantix Terrain Crate make great-looking terrain that's cheaper than scratch-built. Adding these to your collection is far more efficient than adding resin walls. Very few battles in my games take place in hallways. Mostly a hallway is just a place where you go left or right, and it really doesn't need to be depicted. But you can always place a door or an archway indicating there's a turn to the right, or stairs indicating that there's a way to get up a level at the end of the hall. You can always purchase a couple of resin walls or make a couple of your own out of styrofoam. But as someone who's collected dungeon tiles for like 25 years, I gotta say those T-intersections and four-way intersections are among the least used pieces. For cleanup, I just wipe the terrain away with my arm into a box top, and in moments the characters can find their way through the hallways back to the Goblin Temple. But it's more than just a temple. Ultimate Dungeon terrain can be a huge cavern, an ancient ruin, a small tavern, a large tavern, a bedroom, a mad scientist laboratory, even a castle under siege. For versatility and sheer ease of use, nothing beats Ultimate Dungeon terrain. So now I'm going to show you how to make it. Ultimate Dungeon terrain has two parts, a turntable and a removable styrofoam top. If you already have resin terrain, awesome. You could just make the turntable and declutter your play area. The first thing you'll need to acquire is an 18-inch wooden circle and some Lazy Susan hardware. Here's Mrs. Professor Dungeonmaster talking about how to find the center of a circle.
Alright, the first thing you have to do is you have to figure out where is your widest point on your circle. So I measured from this edge to this edge and I got 17 5/8. Then you have to divide that in half and that gives you 8 13/16. So I basically sort of eyeballed an area where I got the 8 13/16 from this direction. Then I made sure that it was the same in this direction, and I did. So I put a little mark here. That was my original mark on. And then I did the same thing from each side to where that same mark is. And it pretty much is 8 13/16 from each of those edges. And then you're going to do the same thing when you get to your Lazy Susan. You want to make sure that your circles are all intersected by the lines that you created, getting you close to the center. And then you just want to make sure you remeasure and make sure that from here to the hole, to the edge of each of those holes, so that you have something directly to measure, are pretty much the same measurement, and that should give you the middle of both of those things.
I had some rubber toolbox liner laying around. Use this to line drawers or throw it in your pickup truck so your tools don't get rattled around. Optionally, you can use felt, which is a lot cheaper, but the rubber prevents the terrain from slipping. It can be expensive, $10 or $15, so see if you can find some at a yard sale or you can bum some off your friends. I glue it down with some Gorilla Glue and I spread it out with a paintbrush. Just be sure to wash the brush with some dish soap afterwards, that way you don't ruin it. Press the liner firmly in place and then trim off the edges with a pair of scissors. I paint the edges with stain, that's stain, not paint, and I wear gloves to make sure that it doesn't stain my skin. This pink stuff is foamular styrofoam insulation. It's available at Home Depot, sorry, not Lowe's, for $5 for like a 3x3 sheet. And then I'm going to carve it up with my utility knife. This is not a cheap utility knife. This is the industrial kind. And if you notice, I'm kind of beveling it as I carve it out because I want the rock face. I don't want it to be straight. I want it to have a gradual incline. If you have one, you could use a hot wire foam cutter. I got this in a set with 3 tools for $30. If you don't have one, again, the utility knife will work just fine. But this is a lot easier on your wrists. I carve out the rock face by carving with my utility knife in kind of V formations. You can't use a hot wire cutter for this, it's going to look too smooth. And I just go in there and I kind of gouge out and break off some pieces. You want to make sure that you constantly switch up the pattern so it doesn't look like it's too uniform. Every once in a while I bevel one of the edges on the top so it looks more natural. Using my yardstick and my gel ink roller pen, I grid out a 1" by 1" grid. Make sure the ballpoint is a 1.6 tip so it's wide enough, and I'm going to use it to carve out some stone patterns. I'm going to alternate. I have a 3-block pattern, a 5-block pattern, and I'm just going to alternate that. Make sure you don't put the same pattern next to each other or in adjacent rows, and you switch up the direction the blocks are facing. I go over the patterns with a styrofoam cutting tool. This one has a very narrow pen-like tip. Alternately, you can use a soldering tool. You want to make sure you get the thinnest tip possible. And And notice as I carve out, I round the edges. That's key to making it look like the type of rough-hewn stone that you might find in a dungeon. Always round those edges. When doing clusters of stone that are close together, use a very light touch. You want to do some practice on that extra styrofoam that you have. You might assume that it's going to take a long time to carve out every one of 100 blocks, but I'm going to set my timer and I'm going to show you it's not going to take that long at all. Now, if you don't have a styrofoam cutter or a soldering tool, you can get a similar effect by using a Sharpie magic marker. Sharpies melt styrofoam. You're not going to get as deep an impression, but it's still going to look pretty good. It's already looking quite dungeony. Here's a close-up of the area, and I was able to complete the entire board in just 31 minutes. Now it's time to add some texture. We're going to roll up a ball of tinfoil and stamp it really hard. When you think you're done, do it another time. That way you're sure you don't miss anything. Close up, it looks like this. Really great camera work. It's all shaking there. That's what happens when you direct your own videos. Now it's time to make like the Rolling Stones and paint it black. Here I'm doing my base coat with very thinned acrylic craft paint. I want to thin it. It's not a wash. It's thicker than that, but I want it thin enough so that it gets in all the cracks and no pink is showing through. I let it dry for several hours, and then I'm going to coat it again with Craft Smart Tan Craft Paint. You can see I've watered it down. It's really watery, and again I'm trying to get in all the cracks. If a little black shows through, that's okay. That little bit of variation will make the rock look more realistic. Even though I let it dry several hours, there was still some wet paint between the cracks. When I coated the surface, you end up with a little bit of gray streaking here, but that's cool. It kind of looks more like realistic stone. I leave this tan base coat to dry overnight so it is thoroughly dry, because my next step is dry brushing, and you need a completely dry surface. I'm dry brushing here with Craft Smart Suede Craft Paint. It's a shade lighter than tan, and when my brush leaves the screen, I am wiping off the excess on a paper towel. I wait for an hour after dry brushing, which is probably overkill, but I want to make sure the surface is completely dry. Then I'm going to give it a wash. I create my black wash with 1 part black craft paint to 10 parts water. I add a little bit of brown and dark green just to make it look grimy, and a small, tiny drop of dish soap to help it flow between the cracks. As an academic, I always cite my sources, and I got this formula from Jeremy over at Black Magic Craft, who makes the best wash. I always allow a wash to dry completely overnight, and the next day I check the color, and if it's not dark enough, I do it again, and I think that's what I did here. When the surface is absolutely completely bone dry, I dry brush it again with that original tan base color. Over the years I've discovered that dry brushing it with tan, not gray, is what makes it look like realistic stone. Next, I will coat the entire surface with Elmer's clear glue to form a hard protective shell. I only do 1 coat using it straight out of the bottle. I don't water it down at all. And this is probably the most expensive step because for some reason Elmer's clear glue is $7, so you better get that Michael's coupon ready. For extra credit, I'm going to add some water effects. I'm going to be using Vallejo water texture and Elmer's clear glue. I made a few holes in the surface and I poured glue into them and let it dry. Then I take some wash, I think this is Drakenhof Nightshade from Citadel, mix it with the Vallejo water texture, and I fill the holes using a paintbrush. Optionally, you can pour the water texture directly into the hole and mix in the Drakenhof Nightshade later. I happen to have Vallejo water texture laying around, but if you don't have it, you could just use clear glue and it'll work almost as well. Once it's dry, hit it with a couple coats of Minwax clear satin polyurethane to seal the glue and provide an extra layer of protection. Let it dry for 24 hours and your ultimate dungeon terrain will be ready for the table. And now for the contest. Here is the prize, the UDT prototype. It's a little smaller and square, but it's perfect if you have a smaller table. Here are the rules. On the first Thursday of the month, I do a campaign update. I'm currently writing a grimdark version of the classic Caves of Chaos. I need an orc leader, this guy. Write up a description and a backstory for him. Include his name, stats, and a unique background that distinguishes him from all the other orc leaders in gaming history. Post it in the comment section below, and keep it to a lean, mean 100 words or less. And here's a tip, don't bother creating magic items. Instead, Think character. Think of what he wants. Winners will be judged by my collaborator, Adhesive Tom, and Mrs. Professor Dungeon Master. All submissions must be posted by the last day of the month, February 2019.
And that is Ultimate Dungeon Terrain. If you like this video, give it the thumbs up. Questions, comments, put them below. And share this video with your cool D&D playing friends. Once again, this is Professor Dungeon Master for Dungeoncraft. Thanks for watching. I'll see you at the table, and may all your rolls be 20s.
If you enjoyed today's content, click the Dungeon Door logo to subscribe to the channel and the bell icon to receive notifications. You can also join our Facebook group and follow us on Twitter at Dungeoncraft.